The family said she was too plain to marry well. The surveyor said she was exactly what he needed. The Haden family of Laurel Creek, Virginia, had 3 daughters, and the family's assessment of those daughters was organized along the axis of appearance, which is the axis along which many families organize their daughters, and which is, as an organizational principle, both common and cruel. The Hadens were not unkind people. They were ordinary people, which is sometimes worse, because ordinary cruelty is invisible to the people committing it, and therefore never corrected. The eldest, Viola, was considered beautiful. The middle daughter, Constance, was considered pretty. The youngest, Nell, was considered plain, and the considering had been done early and often, and with the particular thoughtlessness of people who do not realize that the categories they assign to children become the cages those children live in. Nell Haden was 24 years old in the autumn of 1884, and she had lived inside the cage of plain for as long as she could remember. The cage was not made of iron bars or locked doors, but of remarks, small and constant, and accumulating over years. The way her mother introduced the 3 sisters to visitors and to neighbors, lingering on Viola's cheekbones and Constance's golden curls, and moving past Nell with the speed of someone passing a dish that is adequate but unremarkable. The way her father, when discussing the girl's prospects, spoke of Viola's suitors and Constance's admirers and Nell's reliable and practical skills, as though practical skills were a consolation prize for the absence of beauty. The way the family, as a unit, had decided that Nell would be the one who stayed, who kept house, who tended the garden, who nursed the aging parents, because the plain daughter is always the one who stays, since the staying is a function of having nowhere else to go, and since practical skills, canning, mending, gardening, nursing, bookkeeping, the 1,000 unglamorous competencies that keep a household running, are valued only when they are needed and invisible the rest of the time. Nell did not argue with the assessment. She did not argue, because arguing with a family's assessment of your appearance is a losing proposition, since the family will simply point to your face as evidence, and the evidence, being your face, cannot be refuted. She was not, in fact, plain. She was brown-haired and clear-eyed and strong-jawed and healthy-looking in a way that suggested capability rather than fragility, which in Laurel Creek was interpreted as plainness, because beauty, in Laurel Creek, meant fragility, and fragility meant femininity, and femininity meant marriageable, and the chain of reasoning was as rigid as it was wrong. Nell had her father's jaw and her grandmother's eyes, and the kind of face that looks better at 40 than at 20, a face built for endurance rather than first impressions, which is not a compliment that a 24-year-old woman wants to hear, but which is, as descriptions go, more useful than pretty. Viola married at 19. Constance married at 21. Both married local men from good families. Viola married a merchant's son who had fine manners and a weak chin, and Constance married a young attorney who quoted poetry and had never dug a post hole, and both marriages were celebrated with the enthusiasm that the Haden family reserved for events that confirmed its organizational principles. Nell attended both weddings with a smile that was genuine, because she loved her sisters and wished them well, stood beside both sisters in the church, wore dresses that her mother had chosen for her, dresses that were appropriate but not memorable, and returned to the family house after each wedding to resume her duties as the daughter who stayed. The surveyor arrived in Laurel Creek in October. His name was Duncan Fry, and he was 30 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, employed by the Virginia Central Railroad to survey a proposed westward extension of the rail line through the valley. He was tall and serious, and clean-shaven, precise in his speech and in his measurements. And he wore spectacles, and the particular expression of a man who spends most of his time looking at the land, and who has developed, through the looking, a capacity for seeing things that other people miss. Because surveying is the art of seeing what is actually there, the true elevation, the actual grade, the real distance, rather than what you expect to be there, or what would be convenient if it were there. And that art, once acquired, extends beyond land and into people. He arrived with a transit and a chain and a set of maps, and the need for a local guide, someone who knew the terrain, the creek crossings, the grades, the property lines, the places where the ground was solid, and the places where it was not. He asked at the general store, leaning on the counter with his maps spread out and his hat in his hand. The proprietor, a man named Whitsitt, who had opinions about everything and knowledge about most things, directed him to the Haden house, because the Hadens had been in the valley for 3 generations and knew every foot of ground between Laurel Creek and the ridge. Mr. Haden was not available, as was often the case. Mr. Haden was in Richmond on business. Mrs. Haden suggested Viola's husband, who was not available either, or Constance's husband, who was in court. Mrs. Haden did not suggest Nell, because Nell was not the daughter you suggested for anything that involved being seen by a stranger, particularly a stranger who was young and employed and potentially marriageable, because suggesting Nell for such an encounter would be like sending the adequate dish to a dinner party where the beautiful dishes were expected. Nell was in the garden. She was pulling the last of the season's potatoes, on her knees in the dirt with soil under her fingernails, and her hair pulled back, and her sleeves rolled to her elbows. And she looked up when Duncan Fry appeared at the garden gate, and she said, before he could speak, "You need someone who knows the land." "I do. I know the land. Every creek crossing from here to the ridge, every soft spot, every grade, every property line. I have walked this valley since I was 6 years old. Your mother suggested your brothers-in-law. My brothers-in-law have been in this valley for 3 years and 2 years respectively. I have been here for 24. I know things about this ground that they will not learn in a lifetime, because they do not walk it. They ride over it. Walking and riding are not the same kind of knowing." Duncan Fry looked at Nell Haden. He looked at her the way a surveyor looks at terrain, not with the surface assessment that produces first impressions, but with the deeper assessment that produces accurate measurements, the kind of looking that ignores what is decorative and assesses what is structural, what will bear weight and what will shift, not what is pleasing at first glance, but what will hold weight over time. "Can you start tomorrow?" he asked. They started at dawn, meeting at the garden gate with the morning mist still in the valley, and the first light coming over the ridge in long yellow bands. Nell wore boots and a practical skirt, and carried a walking stick her father had carved from hickory years ago, and she led him along the creek, through the low meadow where the ground was firm, up the grade that followed the old cattle track to the ridge. She showed him where the old Shawnee Trail crossed the creek at the shallowest ford, and the places where the limestone was close to the surface, and the places where the clay ran deep and soft, the places where flooding had changed the creek bed, and the places where the bedrock held the water to a predictable channel that had not shifted in living memory. She knew the land, the way a person knows a language learned in childhood, fluently, instinctively, without pausing to translate. Duncan took his measurements. He recorded elevations, distances, angles. He noted the terrain with the precision his profession required. And he noted Nell with a different kind of precision, the precision of a man who is recognizing something he has been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. He noted her competence, which was total. He noted her knowledge, which was encyclopedic. He noted the way she described the land with precision and affection, as though the valley were a thing she cared about and not merely a thing she lived in. He noted her steadiness, which was the steadiness of a person who has spent a lifetime being undervalued and who has responded not with bitterness, but with the quiet accumulation of worth that does not require external validation, because the worth is in the knowing, and the knowing is its own reward. They worked together for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of walking the valley, measuring the grades, mapping the crossings. 3 weeks of conversation that began with terrain and expanded into everything else. His work with the railroad, which had taken him through Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia and 3 other states, and taught him that the ground beneath your feet is always more interesting than the view from a distance. Her life in the valley, which she described without self-pity, and without the false modesty that would have made the description dishonest, and with the particular honesty of a person who has accepted her circumstances, but who has not accepted that her circumstances define her. "Your family calls you plain," he said one afternoon, not as a question, but as an observation, the way a surveyor states a measurement. "They do. They are wrong. I know they are wrong, but knowing and being heard are different things. I am hearing you. The survey was completed in November. Duncan submitted his report to the railroad. The report recommended the route that Nell had suggested, along the creek, through the low meadow, up the cattle track grade, because the route was the most geologically stable and the most cost-effective, and because Nell's intimate, lifelong knowledge of the ground had produced a survey that was, in Duncan's professional assessment, the most thorough and accurate he had ever conducted. He returned to Laurel Creek in December, on a cold afternoon with the mountains gray against a white sky and the road frozen hard enough to ring like iron under the horses' hooves. He returned not for the railroad, but for Nell, and the returning was deliberate, and the deliberateness was the point, because Duncan Fry was a man who checked his measurements twice, and who did not make imprecise decisions, and who understood that returning to a place for a person is a statement as clear as any measurement. He called on the Haden house on a Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Haden received him in the parlor and offered tea and conversation, and the presence of Viola, who happened to be visiting, and who happened to be wearing her best afternoon dress, with her hair arranged in the style that showed her cheekbones to their greatest advantage, and whose presence was not a coincidence, but a strategy as transparent as glass, because Mrs. Haden understood that a young railroad surveyor was a prospect, and that prospects should be directed toward the beautiful daughter, rather than the plain one. "I am here to see Nell," Duncan said. The parlor went quiet. Mrs. Haden looked at Duncan with the expression of a woman whose organizational principles have just been contradicted by reality. "Nell? Nell. I would like to speak with her, if she is available." Nell was available. Nell was always available, because the plain daughter who stays is always available. Always in the next room, always within earshot, always ready to be summoned for tasks that no one else wants to do. She came to the parlor with dirt on her apron from the winter garden and confusion on her face, and the particular wariness of a woman who has never been the one that anyone came back for. "I need a partner," Duncan said. "Not a guide, a partner. Someone who knows land, the way I know measurements. Someone who can read terrain the way I read a transit. Someone who knows where the ground is solid and where it is not, which is a skill that takes 20 years of walking to develop, and that cannot be taught from a book. I am going to survey the extension through the Kanawha Valley in the early spring, and I want you with me, not as an assistant, as an equal. That is a professional proposal. It is also a personal one. I am asking you to marry me, Nell. I am asking because in 3 weeks of walking this valley with you, I have learned more about the ground and about myself than I learned in 6 years of surveying alone. You are exactly what I need, and what I need is not what your family thinks is valuable, and what your family thinks is valuable is not what lasts. Cheekbones do not survey a railroad. Curls do not read a grade. You read the grade. You know the ground. And I would rather build a life with a woman who knows the ground than with a woman who looks good standing on it." Nell looked at Duncan Fry. She looked at him the way she had looked at the land her entire life, directly, without the filters that other people used to see what they wanted to see, rather than what was there. And what was there was a man who had seen her, actually seen her, with the precision of a surveyor and the honesty of a person who measures the world in facts rather than opinions, and who had come back, in December, through frozen roads and cold mountains, not for the beautiful daughter, or the pretty daughter, but for the one who knew the ground. "Yes," she said. They married in January, on a morning when frost covered the valley, and the mountains were sharp against a sky so blue it looked painted, quietly, in the Haden parlor, with a minister, and the family, and a few neighbors who had been invited, and the particular silence of people who are witnessing something they did not expect, and are not entirely sure how to feel about. Viola attended and kissed Nell's cheek, and meant it. Constance attended and cried, which surprised everyone, including Constance. Mrs. Haden attended and was gracious, because graciousness was her default setting regardless of her internal state, and her internal state was the state of a woman whose organizational principles had been permanently disrupted by a surveyor from Pennsylvania, who had looked at all 3 daughters and chosen the one with dirt on her apron. They left for the Kanawha Valley in March. Nell walked the ground ahead of the survey crew, reading the terrain, marking the crossings, doing the difficult and essential work she had always been capable of, and that no one had asked her to do, until a man with a transit and an honest pair of eyes had walked into her garden and seen what her family had been too close and too comfortable and too careless to see. She wrote to her mother once a month, letters that were warm and factual, and that described the work and the land and the life she was building, with a man who valued what she knew over what she looked like. Mrs. Haden read the letters in the parlor where Viola's wedding portrait hung, and Constance's wedding portrait hung, and where there was no portrait of Nell, and she read them with the growing understanding that she had miscategorized her youngest daughter, and that the miscategorization had been the greatest error of her life, an error she could not undo, but that Nell, with the particular grace of a woman who knows the ground she walks on, had already forgiven.